The Exodus in the Greek is the coming out or the going out of captivity. In the Hebrew, it's Va'ala Shemoth, and it means these are the names, and that refers to the descendants of Israel or Jacob. So, where the book of Genesis introduces God's people Israel as a family, in the book of Exodus, we'll see this family start to emerge as a nation. And in the book of the Numbers, we see Israel not only as a nation, but a blessed nation. Exodus is also about redemption, and in it we see the ultimate redemption of Jesus Christ. So let's start the study of Exodus in the book of Genesis. Go to Genesis chapter 15, verse 12. And when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and lo, a horror of great darkness fell upon him. And he, that's God, said to Abram, Know of a surety that thy seed, that's Israel, shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterwards they shall come out with great substance. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace, thou shalt be buried in a good old age. But in the fourth generation they, Abraham's seed, shall come hither again, for the iniquities of the Amorites is not yet full. And it came to pass that when the sun went down, and it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace, and a burning lamp that passed between those pieces. These pieces were the sacrifice Abraham brought before the Lord in verse 8. In the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, a promise, saying, Unto thy seed, Israel, have I given this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. The Kenites, the Kenizzites, and the Cadmonites, and the Hittites, and the Perizzites, and the Rephaim, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. So understand, God wasn't just simply prophesying to Abraham what will happen in the future. He's telling Abraham what he has already ordained. Now let's go to the book of Exodus, and let's pay close attention to the hand of God throughout this book. Exodus 1 verse 1. Now these are the names, that's Va'ala Shemoth in the Hebrew, of the children of Israel which came into Egypt. Every man in his household came with Jacob. Reuben was the firstborn of Leah, the wife Jacob was deceived into marrying. Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin. Dan was the firstborn of Bilhah, Rachel's handmaid. And Naphtali, Gad was the firstborn of Zilpah, Leah's handmaid. And Asher. And all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. And of course, Joseph was the firstborn of Rachel, Jacob's covenant wife, which is why Joseph was his heir, and why his brothers wanted him dead. And of course, these people are all the seed of Abraham. And the children of Israel were fruitful, and increased abundantly, and multiplied, and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. Now this new king means of a new family, a new dynasty, a foreign king. This knew not Joseph, this doesn't mean he didn't know about Joseph, not historically. It means that he had no regard for Joseph or his family, because he was a foreign king. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 52, verse 4. For thus saith the Lord God, My people went down aforetime into Egypt to sojourn there, and the Assyrian, this new king, this foreign king, oppressed them without cause. Now let's return back to Exodus chapter 1. Let's pick it up at verse 9. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass, that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies, and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters, to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses, and I'll add even the pyramids. Pithom means house of Tum. Tum was one of the many Egyptian gods. So now, let's do something different. Let's go to the Jewish historian Josephus. Let's go to his work, The Antiquities of the Jews, Book 2, Chapter 9. Now, for clarification, Josephus is not a prophet of God, and his writings are not the Word of God, and this is not meant for any doctrinal teaching. He was just a Jewish historian who lived in the 1st century. In fact, he was born shortly after the crucifixion of Jesus. But his knowledge of early Jewish history is probably the most reliable we have, even today. So with that being said, let's go to the Antiquities of the Jews, Book 2. Let's start at Chapter 9. And having in length of time forgotten the benefits that they had received from Joseph, particularly the crown being now come into another family, the Assyrian, we read in the book of Isaiah, they became very abusive to the Israelites and contrived many ways of afflicting them, for they enjoined them to cut a great number of channels for the rivers, and to build walls for their cities and ramparts, that they might restrain the river and hinder its waters from stagnating upon its running over its own banks. So they built dams to protect the cities from the flooding Nile, and these channels were canals built into the dams that brought the waters of the Nile into the cities, making trading a lot easier and making Ramses and Pithom very wealthy cities. Back to Josephus. They set them, Israel, also to build pyramids, and by all this wore them out and forced Israel, to learn all sorts of mechanical arts and to accustom themselves to hard labor. So when you see these documentaries on TV about how brilliant and advanced the Egyptians were in building the pyramids and whatnot, understand it wasn't the Egyptians who were so advanced, it was the Hebrews. Now, back to Exodus, verse 12. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they, the Egyptians, were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor. That means extreme cruelty. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. And the king of Egypt, this new king, the Assyrian, spake to the Hebrew midwives. Now underline that, the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other was Puah. And he said, when ye do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools were 2 rock pillars that were used during the birthing process. If it be a son, then ye shall kill him, but if it be a daughter, then she shall live. Now, to have a better understanding of why the king would command this, let's return to Josephus. Now, one of those sacred scribes, a sacred scribe would be an Egyptian prophet or seer, who was very sagacious in foretelling future events truly, told the king, now listen to the similarities between the babe Moses and the babe Jesus Christ. That about this time there would be a child born to the Israelites, who, if he were reared, would bring the Egyptians' dominion low, and would raise the Israelites, that he would excel all men in virtue and obtain a glory that would be remembered throughout all ages, which thing was also feared by the king, that according to this man's opinion, this seer's opinion, he commanded that they should cast every male child which was born to the Israelites into the river and destroy it. This new king of Egypt kind of sounds like King Herod, doesn't he? Now let's go back to Exodus chapter 1, pick it up at verse 17. But the midwives, these are the Hebrew midwives, feared God and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. And the king of Egypt called for the midwives, the Hebrew midwives, and said unto them, why have ye done this thing, and have saved the men children alive? And the midwives said unto Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively, and they are delivered before the midwives come in unto them. Therefore God dealt with the midwives, the Hebrew midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mighty. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses. Now this is interesting, because there is some disagreement among scholars about how this verse should be taken. E.W. Bullinger, and probably the most popular view, connects this verse with the previous verse. He believes this to mean that God blessed the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, by giving them progeny. He reads it like this. Therefore God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mighty. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he, God, made them, the two midwives, houses. But some other scholars, such as Dr. Shuckford, believe this verse should be connected with the verse that follows, and he reads it like this: And it came to pass, because the Hebrew midwives fear God, that he, Pharaoh, made them, the Hebrews, houses. And Pharaoh charged all his people, including Egyptian midwives, saying, Every son that is born ye shall cast into the river, and every daughter ye shall save alive. Dr. Shuckford points out that the word them is masculine, which points to the Hebrew people as a whole, and not feminine, which would point to the two Hebrew midwives. He explains that because the Hebrews were always a nomadic people, that they continued living in tents even during their captivity. And because of this, they were able to somewhat hide their pregnancies and deliveries from the Egyptians by constantly moving around, which kind of makes sense. He believes that Pharaoh had them build houses for themselves to live in instead of tents to keep them in one place and better keep an eye on them. Now, the commentator John Gill builds on this theory by saying that the houses Pharaoh had built were actually birthing houses, where when it was discovered that a Hebrew woman was pregnant, they would bring her to these birthing houses until their delivery. And by doing so, the infant males were more likely to be put to death by the Egyptian midwives, whose loyalty was to the king and who did not fear the Lord like the Hebrew midwives. Now let's return back to Josephus. That besides this, the Egyptian midwives should watch the labors of the Hebrew women and observe what is born, for those were the women who were enjoined to do the office of the midwives to them, and by reason of the relationship to the king would not transgress his commandments, as did the Hebrew midwives. So, two very good takes on these verses, and I believe that both versions can be true, that God can still bless Shiphrah and Puah by giving them many children, even while Pharaoh was tightening his grip on the Hebrew slaves.